James River Valley, Dakota Territory, autumn 1883. The wind already had a blade to it, a promise of the winter to come. On the vast, flat plains where every structure was a sharp-cornered assertion against the sky, Niels Lundgren was building a circle. Not a soddy, not a dugout, but something no one had ever seen. He was raising a house like a man raises a barrel. Great, curved staves of seasoned oak, each one shaped with a cooper's draw knife, were being fitted together. Iron hoops, forged in his small smithy, lay waiting to be driven tight. To the other settlers, who measured a man by the squareness of his corners and the straightness of his roof line, it was the work of a madman. Virgil Stoddard, the land agent for the railroad, stopped his horse a respectable distance away, watching Niels wrestle a massive stave into place. Stoddard was a man who dealt in square miles and rectangular plots. He saw the world as a grid, and Lundgren's creation was an offense to it. He rode over to Jedediah Crane, who was watching from his half-finished lean-to. "What in God's name is the Dane building?" Stoddard asked, not bothering to lower his voice. "He calls it a house," Crane grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "Looks more like a water tank that's fallen on its side. It's foolishness. That thing will catch the wind and roll clear to Minnesota." The mockery was constant, a low hum of disapproval from every quarter. At the trading post, men who had spent their lives hewing logs and fighting the brutal Dakota winters laughed into their coffee. They called it Niels's cask, or the Lundgren vat. The consensus was clear. The Dane was a fine cooper. Perhaps the best they'd ever seen, but he was no housewright. He was building a monument to his own folly, and his family would pay the price when the first blizzard hit. What did this Danish master cooper, a man who thought in curves and pressures, understand about the unforgiving physics of a Dakota winter that the most experienced cabin builders in the territory had missed? The story of how a brewery artisan defeated a force that broke seasoned frontiersmen is more than just a tale of clever construction. It's a lesson in how the most profound solutions are often found by looking at a problem from an entirely different angle. It's a story about surface area, wind dynamics, and the simple, elegant truth of a circle in a world of squares. If you stick with me, I promise you will learn the fundamental principle of thermal efficiency that Niels Lundgren understood in his bones. A principle that modern engineers still use today. Subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments, what's the most unconventional solution to a common problem you've ever seen work? Niels Lundgren was not a carpenter. He had never framed a wall, notched a log, or shingled a roof in his life. He was a bodker, a master cooper, from a long line of them, hailing from a small town near Aarhus in Denmark. His hands didn't know the language of the broadaxe and the adze. They knew the scorp, the crows, and the driver. He had spent 30 years bending stubborn staves of white oak into perfect, liquid-tight vessels. He had built fermentation vats for breweries that were bigger than most Dakota cabins. Vats that had to withstand the immense constant pressure of thousands of gallons of beer. His world was one of precise geometry, of joints so perfect they needed no caulk, of the immense strength imparted by an iron hoop under tension. He'd come to America with his wife, Anya, and their two small children, Lars and Sophia, drawn by the promise of 160 acres of his own land. Like everyone else, he built a cabin that first year. He followed the advice of his neighbors, men who had been on the prairie for a decade. He cut and squared his logs, notched them with care, and chinked the gaps with a mixture of mud and prairie grass. It looked like a proper house. It felt solid under the mild autumn sun. Then came winter. That first winter, 1882, was not a gentle introduction. By December, the house that had seemed so sturdy began to betray them. The green wood of the logs shrank in the impossibly dry, cold air. The tight corner joints, the pride of every cabin builder, began to open. First, a hairline gap, then a crack wide enough to slide a knife blade into. The wind found every single one. It was a low, constant moan that never ceased, a sound that frayed the nerves and chilled the soul. The chinking froze, cracked, and fell out in chunks, leaving gaping holes for the cold to pour through. The family lived in a state of perpetual, shivering twilight. They burned through their woodpile at an astonishing rate, yet the heat seemed to vanish the moment it left the stove. The walls were coated in a thick layer of frost, a beautiful and deadly filigree of ice that grew thicker every day. Anya's morning routine was to scrape it off with a wooden paddle before it could melt and rot the logs. The details of their suffering were brutally specific. The ash in the firebox was often frozen solid in the morning, a gray block of ice that had to be chipped out before a new fire could be started. The very door frame had racked and twisted in the cold, making the door impossible to close fully. They had to stuff rags into a permanent 1-inch gap, a frail barrier against a wilderness that wanted them dead. Lars and Sophia were always sick, their coughs echoing in the small, cold space. Anya's face, once full and rosy, grew thin and pale. Niels felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. His house, built by the book, was a failure. It was a machine perfectly designed to kill his family. He had followed the rules, and the rules were wrong. The central failure of the conventional frontier cabin wasn't a matter of poor craftsmanship. It was a flaw in the fundamental design, a vulnerability baked into its very geometry. The problem was the corners. In a world of right angles, the corner is where two planes meet, but in the brutal calculus of a Dakota winter, it's where two weaknesses multiply. Every log in a standard cabin was a potential point of failure. Hewn from green wood, it held a tremendous amount of moisture. As the winter air, with its near-zero humidity, wicked that moisture away, the wood shrank. But it didn't shrink evenly. It twisted, checked, and warped. A round log tried to become an oval. A square-hewn log tried to become a rhombus. In the middle of a wall, this movement was constrained by the logs above and below. But at the corners, where the notches interlocked, the forces were complex and unforgiving. The wood shrank away from itself, opening up the joints. This created a direct path for air infiltration. A frontiersman could spend weeks chinking his walls to perfection, but the relentless drying and shrinking of the logs would undo his work in a matter of days. The wind, moving at 40 or 50 miles an hour across the open prairie, acted like a giant bellows, forcing cold air into every new crack and pushing the precious warm air out. You could see it on a windy day. A candle flame held near a corner would dance and flicker wildly, sometimes even extinguishing, revealing an invisible river of Arctic air pouring into the living space. Men like Silas Blackwood, Niels's neighbor to the east, would spend half their winter mixing fresh mud and straw in a bucket by the stove, constantly patching and repatching the chinking on the north wall of his cabin, a losing battle against the laws of physics. The heat loss was catastrophic. The family inside would be feeding cordwood into a cast-iron stove, generating thousands of BTUs of heat. But that heat was immediately sucked away by the invading cold. The interior walls, especially at the corners, would drop to temperatures well below freezing. This created the frost problem. Warm, moist air from cooking and breathing would hit these super-chilled surfaces and instantly condense, then freeze. It wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a structural threat. The ice would work its way into the wood grain, expanding and contracting, further damaging the logs and widening the cracks. The conventional wisdom was to build a bigger fire, to burn more wood, but it was like trying to fill a leaky bucket by pouring water in faster. The fundamental problem wasn't the amount of heat you generated, it was the integrity of the vessel you were trying to contain it in. Niels Lundgren, the cooper, understood vessels, and he knew the cabin he had built was the leakest vessel he had ever seen. The following spring, as soon as the ground thawed, Niels began his real work. He chose a spot with a slight southern exposure, sheltered by a small rise. He did not fell a single tree for logs. Instead, he took his wagon to a stand of white oak he had identified months earlier. He selected mature trees, straight-grained and free of knots, and began the laborious process of riving them into staves. This was not carpenter's work. As a carpenter saws wood, imposing his will upon it. A cooper splits it along the grain, following the wood's own nature, preserving the long, unbroken fibers that give a stave its strength and impermeability. For weeks, the valley was filled with the rhythmic sounds of his work, the thud of the froe, the whisper of the draw knife, the ring of the hammer on the hoops. He built a small steam box, a long wooden tunnel fed by a boiling kettle, where he would soften the thick oak staves until they were pliable. Then, using a winch and a series of forms, he bent each one into a precise, identical curve. He was not building walls. He was creating the components of a single, monolithic shell. The foundation was a ring of fieldstone, meticulously leveled. Upon this he began to raise the staves, standing them on end. Their edges beveled at a precise angle so they would fit together perfectly. There were no corners. Each stave pressed against its neighbors, the gentle curve creating a continuous, unbroken wall. As the circle closed, the structure's inherent strength became apparent. It was a giant horizontal barrel, about 30 feet long and 12 feet in diameter at its widest point. Virgil Stoddard made it a point to ride by every few days, often with another settler in tow, to observe the spectacle. He found Niels fitting the final stave, a complex wedge-shaped piece that would lock the entire structure together. "Lundgren," Stoddard said, his voice dripping with condescending authority. "I've sold land to a lot of men. I've seen them build with sod, with logs, with milled lumber. But I have never, in all my days, seen a man try to raise his family inside a beer cask." A few of the other men laughed. Niels wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He looked at Stoddard, then at his work. "It will be tight," he said, and that was all. He turned back to his task, tapping the final stave into place with a wooden mallet. The next stage was the hoops. Great bands of iron, which he had forged and welded himself, were heated until they glowed red. With Anya's help, he maneuvered the massive, shimmering rings over the wooden shell. Using a heavy hammer called a driver, he began to pound them down. The sound was like a church bell, a deep, resonant clang that echoed across the prairie. As the iron cooled, it contracted, pulling the staves together with immense force, creating joints far tighter than any notched log could ever be. He sealed the ends of the barrel with flattened, double-layered walls, insulated with packed sawdust. He cut openings for a door and 2 small windows, framing them carefully to not compromise the integrity of the shell. Anya watched him, a mix of apprehension and trust in her eyes. "It looks so strange, Niels," she said one evening, looking at the curved, windowless side. "People will think we are living in a giant insect." Niels placed a hand on the warm, curved oak. "Let them," he said. "It is honest. It has no secrets. The wind will not find a place to bite." He had used every bit of his ancient craft. He crowsed a groove into the ends of the staves and fitted the end walls into them, just as he would the head of a barrel. The entire structure was held together by compression and tension. It was a single, unified object. It did not have walls. It was a wall. The genius of Niels Lundgren's barrel house was not in its materials, but in its math. To the other settlers, it looked like whimsical folly. To a physicist, it looked like a perfect solution to a problem of thermal dynamics. The core principle was surface geometry. Imagine two containers, both designed to hold the same amount of interior space, say 2,000 cubic feet. One is a rectangular box, like a typical cabin, measuring 10 feet wide, 20 feet long, and 10 feet high. The other is a cylinder, like Niels's house, with a similar volume. To find the surface area of the box, you calculate the area of all 6 sides. 2 sides at 10 by 10, 200 square feet, 2 sides at 20 by 10, 400 square feet, and 2 sides at 20 by 10, 400 square feet. The total surface area of the box is 1,000 square feet. Now consider the cylinder. Or to achieve the same 2,000 cubic foot volume, it would have a radius of about 5 feet and a length of about 25.5 feet. Its surface area consists of the 2 circular ends and the curved side. The math is a bit more complex, but the result is what matters. The total surface area of the cylinder is approximately 880 square feet. That is a difference of 120 square feet, or a reduction of 12%. Niels's house, simply by virtue of its shape, had 12% less exterior wall exposed to the killing cold than a rectangular cabin, enclosing the exact same amount of living space. In the economy of heat, where every square inch of exposed surface is a tiny window through which precious warmth escapes, a 12% advantage is monumental. It's the difference between comfort and survival. The heat is lost from a building in 3 ways: conduction, through solid materials; convection, through moving air; and radiation, as infrared energy. The barrel design attacked all 3. The reduced surface area directly minimized heat loss through conduction and radiation. There was simply less of the house touching the outside world, but the most significant advantage was its defense against convection, which on the prairie meant the wind. Wind doesn't just make you feel colder. It actively steals heat by stripping away the thin, stable layer of air that clings to a building's surface, a layer known as the boundary layer. The faster the wind, the thinner the boundary layer, and the more rapidly heat is conducted away from the wall. A flat wall is a disaster in high wind. The wind hits it directly, creating immense positive pressure and turbulence. This turbulence scours away the boundary layer, maximizing heat loss. Worse, it forces air into every tiny crack and seam. At the corners, the wind creates vortices and areas of negative pressure, which literally suck warm air out of the building from the other side. This is why the corners of a cabin are always the coldest and draftiest points. A curved wall, however, is aerodynamic. The wind flows smoothly over its surface. It doesn't slam into it. It slides around it. This creates far less turbulence and preserves a much thicker, more insulating boundary layer of air. There are no corners to create pressure differentials and vortices. The wind simply glides past, unable to get a purchase, unable to find a seam to pry open. The continuous shell of the coopered house, held under thousands of pounds of pressure by the iron hoops, presented a seamless, impenetrable face to the wind. Niels hadn't just built a shelter, he had built an airfoil. He had taken the single greatest threat of the prairie, the relentless wind, and neutralized it with geometry. That winter, the prairie decided to test the Danes' creation with a special kind of fury. It began not with snow, but with rain. In the middle of January, a freakish warm front pushed temperatures just above freezing for half a day. A steady, miserable rain fell, soaking everything. Then, the Arctic hammer fell. The temperature plummeted 40 degrees in 6 hours. Every drop of water froze where it lay. The James River Valley was transformed into a world of glass. Every tree branch, every blade of prairie grass, every cabin wall was encased in a thick, clear sheath of ice. The beauty was breathtaking and deadly. Then came the cold. For 6 consecutive days, the temperature never rose above 25 degrees below zero. The wind was a constant physical presence, a torrent of invisible knives sweeping across the ice-locked land. For the settlers in their square cabins, it was a nightmare. The ice sealed their windows and doors. The weight of it on the roofs groaned and cracked the rafters. The Miller family's lean-to kitchen collapsed under the load. The ice worked its way into the chinking of every cabin, expanding as it froze, widening every crack. The wind howled through these new openings, making a mockery of their fires. Families huddled together under every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the air inside their own homes. Woodpiles vanished at an alarming rate. Livestock, or their coats caked in ice, began to die in their barns. Inside the barrel house, a different reality prevailed. The rain had run off the curved roof as quickly as it fell, leaving only a thin glaze of ice that the wind quickly scoured away. The family was warm. The small, efficient stove radiated a steady, comfortable heat that filled the space. There were no drafts, none. The candle on their small table burned with a steady, unwavering flame. The air was still. The only sound was the muffled howl of the wind as it slid harmlessly over the curved oak shell. Anya was able to do laundry, hanging the wet clothes on a line strung near the stove, an act of domestic normalcy that would have been unthinkable in any other house in the valley. The smell of baking bread filled the warm air. Lars and Sophia, dressed in simple wool shirts, played on a rug on the wooden floor, their faces flushed with warmth, not fever. Niels sat at the table, repairing a piece of harness, his hands steady, his mind at peace. He had built a proper vessel. It was holding his family safe. On the 4th day of the deep freeze, disaster struck the O'Malley family. A gust of wind, channeled by the river bend, hit their cabin with unusual force. An entire section of the ice-laden north wall, its corner joints already weakened by the cold, simply gave way. A shower of frozen chinking, ice, and splintered wood exploded inwards, and the full force of the Arctic gale flooded their home. It was a catastrophic failure. Patrick O'Malley, his face a mask of desperation, managed to get his wife and 3 small children to Virgil Stoddard's house, the largest and best built in the area. But Stoddard already had 2 other families sheltering in his home. There was no more room. Every structure was packed with refugees, except one. Stoddard looked at O'Malley's shivering family, then thought of the Danes' strange barrel. It was an act born of equal parts duty and cynical curiosity. He had to put them somewhere, and he wanted to see the final, definitive proof of Lundgren's folly. He expected the O'Malleys to be back within the hour, complaining of the cold, the strangeness, the foolishness of it all. "There's one place left," Stoddard told O'Malley. "The Danes' barrel. It's not much, but it's out of the wind. Take your family there. Lundgren will take you in." The O'Malleys, in no position to argue, trudged through the wind-scoured snow to the curved structure. Hours passed. They did not return. The next morning, being with the wind still raging, Stoddard found he couldn't stand the suspense. Bundled to his eyes, he made his way to Niels' homestead. The first thing he noticed was the proof. It was so simple, so stark. He couldn't believe he'd never considered it. Every flat surface in the valley, the walls of his own house, the barns, the fences, was plastered with a thick layer of wind-driven snow clinging to the ice, acting as a testament to the wind's brutal impact. But the curved staves of Lundgren's house were bare. The snow, like the wind, could find no purchase. It was scoured clean and dry, the dark oak gleaming in the pale winter light. He reached the door and knocked. Niels opened it, and a wave of silent, steady warmth washed over Stoddard's face. It was not the scorching, temporary heat of an overdriven stove, but a deep, ambient warmth that seemed to emanate from the very walls. He stepped inside. The air was still and quiet. He saw the Lundgrens, and he saw the O'Malleys. Mrs. O'Malley was sitting in a chair, holding her sleeping baby, a look of profound, exhausted relief on her face. Her other two children were asleep on a mattress on the floor, sharing a blanket with Lars and Sophia. Patrick O'Malley stood up as Stoddard entered. Stoddard had expected to find them miserable, huddled around the stove in a cramped, bizarre shelter. He had come to fetch them, to offer them a place on his own floor, now that some space had cleared. "O'Malley," Stoddard began, "I can make room for you back at my place now." Patrick O'Malley shook his head. "We're all right here, Mr. Stoddard. With respect, we'll be staying." His wife nodded in agreement, her eyes never leaving her sleeping child. "It's quiet in here," O'Malley added, struggling for the words. "The wind is gone." Stoddard was speechless. He took off his thick glove. He had expected to feel the biting cold radiating from the walls, the telltale sign of a losing battle against the outside. He reached out and placed his bare palm flat against the curved oak. He expected to feel the deep, penetrating cold of a log wall, a cold that felt like it was actively sucking the life from his hand. Instead, the wood was shockingly neutral. It was cool, but it wasn't cold. It felt inert, solid, peaceful. It was the feeling of victory. He looked at Niels, who was watching him with his usual calm expression. The land agent, the man of square deals and right angles, finally understood. He saw the unbroken shell, the still air, the sleeping children. He saw a design that didn't fight the prairie winter, but yielded to it, shedding its force like water off a duck's back. He looked around the small, warm, life-filled space. "You didn't build a house, Lundgren," Virgil Stoddard said, his voice full of a new, quiet respect. "You built a ship for sailing through the winter." The story of the O'Malley family's refuge in the barrel house spread through the valley as soon as the storm broke. It wasn't the technical details that people repeated, but the simple, human fact. While every other cabin had failed or struggled, the Danes' foolish cask had become a sanctuary. The mockery stopped, replaced by a grudging, then open curiosity. The ultimate validation, however, came from an unlikely source. In the spring of 1884, Ridiculed, a traveling photographer named Theodore Morris, passed through the James River Valley. He was documenting the settlement of the Dakota Territory for a series of stereographs. He was drawn to the unique structure on Niels Lundgren's claim, not for its thermal properties, but for its sheer novelty. He took several plates of the barrel house, with the Lundgren family standing proudly in front of it. One of those images, sharp and clear, captured the elegant, powerful curve of the house against the vast, flat horizon. Morris sent the plate to the Dakota Pioneer in Yankton and the Bismarck Tribune. Both papers ran the photograph, accompanied by a short article. The headline in the Pioneer read, "A Cooper's Solution to the Prairie Wind. Dakota settler builds home like a barrel, stays warm through brutal winter." The story was a sensation. It wasn't just local gossip anymore. It was documented fact, printed for all to see. The photograph gave a tangible reality to the rumors. There it was, undeniable and strangely beautiful. Letters began to arrive for Niels, inquiries from as far away as Nebraska and Montana, from homesteaders desperate for a better way to survive. Niels, a man who preferred the company of his tools to that of strangers, answered them all patiently. He never promoted himself or sought to profit from his design. He simply explained the principles as he understood them: the strength of the curve, the importance of a tight joint, the way the wind would respect a smooth surface. By the following autumn, the idea had begun to take root, Few settlers had the specialized skills of a master cooper to build a perfect barrel house. But the core principle, the avoidance of corners, was adaptable. On a neighboring claim, a German family named Schmidt built a new home with a conventional rectangular footprint, but they rounded the corners using shaped stones and a thick mortar. Another family built a small octagonal cabin, reasoning that more, shallower angles were better than 4 sharp ones. These were hybrid solutions, compromises, but they were a direct result of the lesson Niels had taught them. They were thinking about the wind. They were thinking about geometry. By 1886, at least 5 families in the valley had incorporated curved walls or rounded corners into their new construction, and all of them reported a dramatic reduction in fuel consumption and a startling increase in winter comfort. The barrel house had become more than a curiosity. It had become a catalyst for innovation. The quiet Danish cooper, with his deep knowledge of an ancient craft, had unknowingly anticipated principles of building science that would not be fully appreciated for another century. His barrel house was, in essence, a primitive form of a structural insulated panel, a monolithic shell with minimal thermal bridging. The lack of corners eliminated the single greatest point of failure and air infiltration in standard log construction. His aerodynamic design is the ancestor of the modern monolithic dome home, structures renowned for their incredible energy efficiency and resistance to high winds. Engineers today use computational fluid dynamics to model how wind flows over a building. In seeking to minimize turbulence and pressure differentials, a process Niels Lundgren accomplished intuitively with a draw knife and a steam box. The concept of a continuous airtight envelope is a cornerstone of modern high-performance building standards like Passive House. They speak of blower door tests and measure air changes per hour. Niels spoke of building a vat that could hold beer without leaking. The language is different, but the principle is identical. He understood that a house, like a barrel, is a vessel. Its primary job is to keep what's inside in and what's outside out. The settlers of his day focused only on the strength of the walls. Niels focused on the integrity of the joints. He knew that a structure is only as strong and as tight as its weakest connection. In a world of squares, he built a circle, and in doing so, he created a home that was decades ahead of its time. There is a profound lesson in the gentle curve of Niels Lundgren's house. The settlers of the plains brought their traditions with them, and those traditions were overwhelmingly linear. They built square houses on square plots of land, plowing straight furrows that ran to the horizon. They imposed a rigid Euclidean geometry on the wild, flowing landscape. They saw the world as something to be divided, squared off, and conquered. But nature has no corners. The wind does not turn at right angles. It flows in elegant, powerful curves. A tree does not grow in a straight line. It reaches for the sun in a pattern of organic strength. The river carves its path through the land in a series of sinuous bends. The very planet we stand on is a sphere. The logic of the natural world is the logic of the circle, the spiral, the curve. The failure of the square cabin was a failure of imagination. It was an attempt to fight the prairie on its own terms, to meet its force with rigid, unyielding strength. But the prairie always found the weak point, the corner, and broke it. Niels Lundgren's genius was not that he was a better builder, but that he was a better observer. He was a man whose entire trade was based on understanding and cooperating with the internal forces of wood, of creating strength through unified tension rather than brute opposition. He saw the wind not as an enemy to be blocked, but as a current to be navigated. He built a house that didn't try to stop the river of air, it simply let it flow by. He aligned his small, man-made creation with the vast, in the ancient logic of the world around him. He saw that the strongest shape was not the one that resisted nature, but the one that harmonized with it. He built a house that acknowledged a simple, powerful truth. Nature has no corners, and perhaps the safest and warmest place for a family shouldn't either. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found the science and history as fascinating as we did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories of forgotten innovators. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think modern architecture has lost some of the simple, practical wisdom of builders like Niels Lundgren? We look forward to reading your responses. Disclaimer. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect. However, the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and physical laws. The application of any historical building technique in a modern context should be undertaken only after consultation with qualified architects and engineers, and in full compliance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice